Welcome to The Explainer. Let me ask you something right off the bat. Is the world you see, the world you remember, the actual real world? Or, and this is where it gets weird, is your brain just creating a version of it specifically for you? All right, let's dive into this because what science is telling us about our own minds is, well, it's absolutely mind-bending. Okay, let's start with a really quick test. Just look at this image. What's the main shape you see right there in the center? So if you said a white triangle, you're like pretty much everyone else. But take a closer look. The lines that make up that triangle, they don't actually exist. They're not there. Your brain just filled in the gaps. It created an illusion by making its best guess based on the visual clues it had. And that right there is the perfect illustration of a fundamental truth about our minds. They don't just passively record what's out there like a camera. Nope, they are active storytellers, constantly interpreting, guessing, and literally constructing the world around us. And that whole process, while it's incredibly useful, it's not always accurate. This brings us to a really important distinction we have to make. On one hand, you have objective reality, the world of physics, matter, stuff as it actually is. But then you have subjective reality, and that's your brain's unique, heavily edited, personalized story about the world. And honestly, that's the only reality any of us can ever truly experience. So you've got to be asking, why would our brains even do this, right? Why not just give us the truth, the whole unvarnished truth? Well, the answer, like with so many things, comes down to one word: survival. See, evolution wasn't selecting for brains that could see the world with perfect objective accuracy. I mean, that would be incredibly slow and burn a ton of energy. Instead, evolution selected for brains that could create a useful model of reality, a model that helps us make quick decisions to find food, avoid becoming food, and just, stay alive. And to be that fast, our brains rely on something called heuristics. You can just think of them as mental shortcuts. Imagine a monkey swinging through the trees. It doesn't have time to do a full structural analysis of every branch. It makes a split-second assumption. Brown shape probably means sturdy branch. Now that shortcut is super efficient, but it's a simplification. And simplifications, well, they can sometimes lead to mistakes. And this whole process is being pushed along by some really deep psychological needs. Researchers have kind of boiled it down to three big ones. First, we have an epistemic need. That's the need to understand our world and just make sense of things. Then there's an existential need, the need to feel safe and like we have some control. And finally, a social need, to feel good about ourselves in the groups we belong to. Our brains are constantly building realities that satisfy these powerful drives. Okay, so how does this actually happen? Let's peel back the layers a bit and look at how these shortcuts in motivations actually bend the truth. And we're going to start with one of the most fundamental things our minds do: making memories. Memory isn't like hitting play on a video recording. Not at all. It's a reconstructive process. Think about it in three stages. You've got encoding, which is taking the information in, then consolidation, storing it away, and finally, retrieval, pulling it back out. The crazy thing is, errors and little distortions can sneak in at any of those stages, and that's how we end up with what we call false memories. In fact, let's try a little experiment right now. I'm going to read you a list of words. Just do your best to remember as many as you can. Ready? Okay. Bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, and doze. Got 'em? Okay, now quick question for you. Was the word sleep on that list? Just think about it for a second. The answer is no, it wasn't there. If you thought it was, don't worry, but you just experienced a false memory firsthand. This is a classic demonstration. Your brain didn't really focus on remembering the exact words, the verbatim info. Instead, it grabbed the general meaning, the gist of the list, and then it just falsely inserted the most obvious word that fit: sleep. And it's not just our memories that are getting this treatment. Our minds are also constantly filtering everything we see to match up with what we already believe. This is a huge one. It's called confirmation bias. We actively look for information that proves us right, and we tend to just ignore or explain away anything that suggests we might be wrong. Here's a perfect real-world example. Take two people, let's call them Sally and Henry. They read the exact same headline, but because they start with totally different beliefs, they interpret that same information in completely opposite ways. They're not just reading the news, they're basically seeing a reflection of their own worldview staring back at them. And here's another mental slip up that I guarantee we've all done: the source monitoring error. This is when you remember a piece of information perfectly, but you completely forget where you learned it. Did you read it in a scientific journal, or did your uncle mention it at a barbecue? That context is everything, but it's usually the first part of the memory to just fade away. A fantastic example of this in action is the false fame effect. So in these studies, people see a list of totally made-up, non-famous names. A day or two later, they see a new list with famous people, new non-famous names, and those old non-famous names from before. And what happens? They consistently pick out the old non-famous names as being famous. Why? Just because the name feels familiar, and their brain makes a mistake and says, oh, that familiarity must mean they're famous. Now look, these aren't just fun little brain teasers or quirky things our minds do. These cognitive glitches, from a simple memory slip to a powerful bias, they have some pretty profound real-world consequences. I mean, on a personal level, these little false memories can be a big deal. Did you actually take your medication this morning, or are you just remembering thinking about taking it? Did you really lock the car door, or is that just the memory from yesterday playing on a loop? These everyday mix-ups can have some serious health and safety issues. And this is where it gets even bigger. When you scale this up from one person to a whole society, our individuals' subjective realities start to overlap and merge. And over time, these shared beliefs about things like money or laws or even nations, they become so baked into our culture, so institutionalized, that they feel like objective facts to the next generation. Sociologists have a term for this: the social construction of reality. And this environment is just fertile ground for conspiracy theories. Think about it. Some big, chaotic, scary event happens. A conspiracy theory comes along and offers a simple, neat story that explains everything and tells you who to blame. It perfectly feeds those deep psychological needs we talked about earlier: the need for answers, the need for control, and often the need to point a finger at some other group. But here's the catch. Research shows that this feeling of understanding and control comes at a really high price. Being exposed to conspiracy theories doesn't actually empower people. In fact, it's been shown to decrease trust in major institutions like science and government. And ironically, it often makes people less likely to get involved in politics, leaving them feeling more powerless than before. So where does that leave us? It kind of seems like our brains are fundamentally unreliable narrators of our own lives. So what are we supposed to do about it? How do we get by in a world that's built on all of these subjective stories? Well, the big takeaway here shouldn't be that our brains are just broken. Not at all. In fact, realizing that your mind is actively constructing your reality, that's the first step towards true critical thinking. You can think of it as a superpower. It lets you question your own assumptions, it pushes you to seek out different viewpoints, and it helps you understand that your version of the world isn't the only one out there. And that really leaves us with one final and, I think, pretty crucial question. If we can accept that our own reality is a subjective construction, a story our brain is telling us to help us survive, then what kind of responsibility does that give us to genuinely try to understand the very, very different realities that other people are living in? Yeah, that's something I think about.